Dad's Army is one of Britain's best-loved sitcoms following the exploits of the Home Guard in the fictional town of Warmington-on-Sea during the Second World War. While remembered for its comedy, it occasionally tackled some surprisingly serious themes. In this episode, we're looking at Branded. First broadcast on the 20th of November 1969, it begins when Captain Mainwaring receives a letter of resignation from the gentle and universally liked Private Godfrey. Asked to explain his decision, Godfrey admits that he was a conscientious objector during the First World War. Mainwaring is appalled, and when the rest of the platoon learn the truth, they quickly turn against him. Only at the very end we discover the full truth. Although he objected to bearing arms, Godfrey served in the Royal Army Medical Corps and won the military medal on the Somme for rescuing wounded men under fire. Suddenly, the platoon's assumptions about courage and duty are turned on their head. The episode raises some fascinating questions. What did it actually mean to be a conscientious objector during the First World War? How accurate is Dad's Army's portrayal? And does the episode reflect wartime attitudes or the way Britain remembered the Great War decades later? Adding another layer of authenticity, two members of the cast had served in the First World War themselves. Arnold Ridley, who played Godfrey, and John Laurie, better known as Private Fraser. Hello and welcome to What a Lovely Podcast. I'm Angus Wallace and joining me are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshaw. Chris, you spotted this.
I did.
You're a Dad's Army regular.
I do quite like a bit of Dad's Army, but this one stuck in my head. And to give the listeners a little kind of behind the scenes thing, that kind of what kind of led into this was, it was after the last recording. And I mentioned that there was this Dad's Army episode that we should probably watch, but also that Arnold Ridley had like a very bad First World War experience. And the thing is that when you say that, it's kind of like, yeah, there's a lot of that going around during the First World War. But actually, when we were then kind of double checking the details, Arnold Ridley has a horrendous First World War experience. Like even on our sliding scale of this could get pretty bleak, he gets bayoneted in the leg and groin, rifle butt to the head, suffers from seizures for the rest of his life. I think one of his arms
He's riddled with shrapnel, was on the Somme.
So there's a book that I then got hold of after Chris mentioned this. It quotes the book that his son then writes, which is Ridley's biography, which his son says, yeah, he didn't really talk about it much. And it's one of the few times where, I'm always slightly skeptical of the didn't talk about it much, because it's really a question of context. A lot of veterans do talk about their war. They just don't talk about it necessarily to their children. And this one you're going, yeah, I can sort of see why the only thing they knew about this was because of the nightmares. It sounds, really all the cliches of what we tend to think of as the veteran experience.
And also clearly, like, one of the things that we don't necessarily think about as although again we know that it happens, is there's a tendency to construct the violence of the First World War as happening at a distance, artillery barrage, rifle fire, machine gun fire, where quite clearly, I mean, yes, Arthur Ridley has the riddled with shrapnel, but all of his other wounds come from hand-to-hand combat, which is very up close and personal. I can't imagine that's an easy, I'm just going to sit down with my kids and tell them about the time I got stabbed.
But then, curiously, whilst he might not have talked about it, he must have felt some sort of patriotism because he volunteers for the Second World War and becomes a major in the Second World War, although he's sort of retired out on medical grounds from quite early on in the Second World War, and serves with the BEF in France in 1940, which again I think is quite interesting, because the idea that he's been injured and suffered so much might mean, I guess this relates back to the episode, that he wants to be a conscientious objector and avoid the Second World War, but actually he feels the tug to support his country in the Second World War and volunteers.
Yeah, it's like, go home, Arnold. Honestly, it's fine. You've done enough.
But it's quite interesting because the episode is based on this premise that to have been a conscientious objector is to have been a coward, right? That's the whole central joke in some ways, or the central irony, that is the idea that unwillingness to kill makes you a coward. And then he's awarded a military medal. What I find fascinating is the way in which it is a historically inaccurate cliche about the overlapping relationships between conscientious objection, medical service, military service. So at this point, I need to actually go and watch the episode, I should say. But reading the summary, it's not entirely clear how during the First World War Godfrey is supposed to have stated his conscientious objection. Did he refuse active combat service? Presumably then he agreed to go into the RAMC, which was a valid way of fulfilling the needs of conscription for those who were non-absolutist conscientious objectors. But then he's in military service. He is a soldier. If he's in the Royal Army Medical Corps, he is a uniformed soldier. And certainly by the end of the war, the RAMC was seen as being incredibly brave, particularly for going out under fire without carrying guns. To face death without being able to defend oneself was seen as psychologically really, really brave by a lot of men who did serve in combat roles. So that idea that to have been a conscientious objector and refused to kill was so commonly understood as a mark of cowardice. That's an interesting revision after about 60 years.
A fair amount of the kind of background is implied, and quite a lot actually happens off screen during the episode. Like Mainwaring's explanation to the platoon happens off screen, and various other bits and pieces happen off screen as well. But it's kind of the background behind Godfrey's resignation from the platoon is that he found a mouse in his larder, and he knows that mice eat stuff, and they're when rationing's going on, it's a bad thing to have mice, and also they're kind of impacting the war effort. But he couldn't bring himself to kill it, so he released it outside, and realizing that if he couldn't bring himself to kill a mouse, he couldn't bring himself to kill a German. Leads him to resign from the platoon. So it seems like there is a very, very kind of strong pacifist thread running through Godfrey, but it's just kind of implied that he agreed to join the RAMC or so.
Conscientious objection is a term that actually is a wide spectrum. It could mean doing absolutely nothing. It could mean agreeing to work in arms factories but not in uniform, or it could mean being in uniform and doing manual labour, or it could mean being in uniform and in a non-combatant role. But we kind of forget that now. We like to just lump everybody into the pacifist role. I sort of watched it feeling that the implication was that he'd volunteered to serve, but in a non-combatant role. But what was ambiguous was that he do that, or was he pushed to do that? And I felt the character of Godfrey, just because he's volunteered for the Home Guard, might well be that he joined up early in the Royal Army Medical Corps to do his bit, which is what he's doing, obviously, in the Second World War.
And he's very understated, modest, which comes back to him, the fact that he's not wearing his military medal, which there's a brilliant bit at the end, which I imagine we'll come to. But the kind of the very kind of, it's not self-deprecating in an ostentatious sense. Godfrey is very, very kind of modest about himself, and so it does kind of fit in with the idea that he did volunteer to do it because it was the thing to be done.
That's a slight misunderstanding of one's ability to volunteer for the medical corps. So we're back to timing, because of course before 1916 you can't be a conscientious objector. We've said this on this podcast before. You can resist the war, you can argue against the war, but until conscription comes in with the conscientious objection clause that says you can refuse conscription on the basis of conscience, you cannot be a conscientious objector because you cannot volunteer for the RAMC after early 1915. So you can in the very early months of the war, but in 1915 they realize there's going to be a manpower crisis, and the only volunteers they will then take for the RAMC are officers who have medical degrees, because you have to have a medical degree to be an officer. And they have a whole bunch of medical students who volunteer early in 1914, who they then send back to medical school and say, no, go and get your qualifications and come back and we'll take you as an officer, not as a dresser, which was, that role becomes eliminated. It is impossible to actually volunteer for the RAMC, because they're worried that people are going to try and get out of healthy men are going to try and get out of combat by volunteering for a non-combatant unit. And then when conscription is brought in, it becomes an option there are negotiations with various groups, including the Friends Ambulance Unit, who say, we will make it an option that we will, if you're conscripted, you can say, I have conscientious objection, but I will serve in the military in the RAMC. And there are men who are taken that way.
So Military Service Act comes in January 1916, and Godfrey serves on the Somme. Now, obviously, the Somme goes on from July to November, but I'm wondering how quickly you could be conscripted, say you're a conscientious objector, join the RAMC, presumably go through some kind of training, and then get out onto the Western Front for the Somme. I mean, the implication whenever people talk about the Somme is that they're always talking about July 1916, but, it takes up half the year. So that aspect...
By November, yeah. I think training could have been about 6 weeks, but then it's a question for you, Angus. At what point would the conscription process have started, and how long would the appeals process go on for?
Well, February are the first tribunals. It takes a month to work your way through that. Gets you through March, April, May, June, July, August. He'd be turning up in September, October. Would you get specialist training? I might be wrong, Jessica, but are the Royal Army Medical Corps carrying stretchers in no man's land, which is what he wins his military medal for?
You do get RAMC bearers who go out into no man's land. They're not supposed to, in theory. And it would be quite interesting. Getting a military medal for a ranker is really unusual anyway, right? Because it needs the witness of two officers, and there are various reasons. There's endless complaints about officers getting medals which men get, for work that men have done, or men are overlooked or ignored, and I think it will be even harder for an RAMC bearer in those circumstances. Yeah, I wouldn't be so shocked in having been in no man's land, just because there are plenty of examples of RMC bearers. They just go and do it. They're not supposed to, but at that point they're just, and particularly not the Somme particularly, but certainly during Third Eve, during Passchendaele, the RMC bearers just go out and help the regimental stretcher bearers, because they're very proud of the fact that they're trained to carry 4 to a stretcher, and the regimental bearers who haven't had as much stretcher drill need 6 to a stretcher. But in the mud of Passchendaele, everybody's doing 6 to a stretcher, so they need the extra manpower.
In which case, the balance of evidence would suggest he volunteers in 1914.
Yes, because the other thing I was going to say is, whilst it's difficult to get the age of all of the characters in Dad's Army, Godfrey is at least positioned as one of the more infirm, so potentially older. So take 20 years off of his life or so. How old would he have been in 1916 to be amongst the first conscripted? Feels like he would have been quite a long way down the list.
If he's 75 in 1940 for Dad's Army, he'd be overage as it was.
Even taking into account the Derby schemeness that foregoes it.
You do get overage and medically unfit men, usually with bad eyesight, volunteering for the RAMC, or being, volunteering and being sent to the RAMC in 1914. I've got dozens of examples of those. So that would make sense. He's overage, he wants to serve his country, he volunteers, but that doesn't explain the conscientious objection.
Well, maybe he labelled himself as one. That's why he chose the RAMC, and he's taken on a 1916 label to place upon himself to justify his role.
That's slightly unlikely, given the way in which IMC resisted being classed as conscious. They hated the fact that there is this association.
But perhaps not by 1940, when there's 80,000 conscientious objectors for the Second World War. It's more because there's this strange lens. We're reviewing a 1969 show through the lens of 1940, and then talking about 1916. So it gets quite muddied along the way.
And can anyone explain how it's taken till season 3 for him to realise he doesn't think he can kill Germans potentially, which raises a whole issue about the nature of the Home Guard.
Well, that's always been like an ongoing thing of like Dad's Army has kind of cuddlified the Home Guard in comparison to what it was that they were actually preparing to do. Well, I imagine we'll come back to the historical bits and pieces shortly. But one thing that I should flag up, and I was talking to Angus about this beforehand, is that it's still funny. In the same way that Blackadder is still funny, Dad's Army is still funny. There are jokes in there that are good, that still land. It's still coherent as a comedy piece, which is quite pleasing, because it's one of those shows that it's kind of you're aware of it on in the background, but actually I'm going to sit down and watch it, even because it's particularly difficult to find now. I think Angus got it from Apple TV. I discovered that you can view it in America on YouTube, but not in the UK. So obviously I didn't use a VPN. I did the honest thing of getting on a plane to America so I could watch Dad's Army and then flying back. But actually sitting down and dedicatedly watching it, it's still funny. It's still an enjoyable watch.
What's interesting as well about that humour, so they take that, and I can't remember where the exchange comes from about, what would you, to the conscientious objector, the military rep says, what would you do if your sister's being attacked by the Nazi Hun? But Mainwaring says in a conversation with Wilson, Mainwaring says, suppose you just finished work at the bank and went for tea with Mrs. Pike. When you arrived, you found some Nazi stormtrooper forcing his attentions on her. How would you feel? Wilson, oh, really, sir? Mainwaring, that strikes home, doesn't it? Cuts to the bone. So they've taken that 16, 17 conceit and more or less shifted the whole phrasing to 1940, but it's quite funny by 1969.
Was that the famous question asked of Bertrand Russell?
I would insert myself between the two, or is that the response?
Either, yeah. Which is genuinely funny, even without being a comedy show.
And there's something else. There's perhaps a second episode we need that's worth watching is the 1972 Christmas special, because they're all asked to turn up on parade wearing their medals, but Mainwaring suppresses the order because he's the only one who never served during the First World War. So when Wilson eventually issues the order, they all turn up with a row. Clive Dunn,
has got everyone.
Got a tremendous amount of medals. Although Clive Dunn probably didn't serve in the First War, but Mainwaring is the only one who hasn't. So it's interesting that throughout the whole series, the First World War is quietly in the background, not just this episode. And it's interesting then that Mainwaring's. Well, I was going to say Mainwaring takes the idea, it's damned Conchy, but actually the whole platoon really. Fraser's just the same, isn't he? The Scotsman takes the whole. It's only sort of Ian Lavender who's a bit miffed by the whole thing and not really sure what's going on.
Wilson isn't fully on board with it either, but that's very Wilson of his character. But then Fraser then does the traditional Fraser 180 later in the show. I always knew that he was a man of upstanding conviction. What's it kind of interesting, because you're right that the First World War is always in the background. It feels like it's further, like it's longer ago in Dad's Army. It feels like it was like almost bordering on like the past. It was a long time ago, the previous war, when really it isn't that long ago at all. In 1940, it feels like a more remote thing.
That's perhaps because if you look at the characters, I was just thinking about the characters of the year. John LeMessurier is 55 in it or something like that when they filmed it. So say he's playing his own age, but it's meant to be 1940. That sort of puts him early 20s, mid 20s. Not as necessarily young as you think. I mean, we all think that it's 18-year-olds that go to war. Clearly, it's not. But actually, even then, they were probably older during the time of the First World War than you might otherwise have assumed.
And they look older than they actually are, all of them, apart from Ian Lavender.
I think Clive Dunn's one of the youngest of the cast, still in his 40s.
Yeah, which is mad.
Playing Jones.
It's an interesting thing about the way in which we because Dad's Army has become such a talisman for the Home Guard. It's really interesting because Jessica Hammett's work on the history of the ARP, there are an awful lot of First World War ex-servicemen who do exactly that. They either rejoin to fight if they're allowed, as we've discussed earlier, or they join the Home Guard or the ARP. This idea that they're superannuated is really interesting because there is a sense during the Second World War, the First World War being Dad's war, right? That Dad might be a bit younger and a bit more active than we think in that sense. Time does funny things.
As this is 1969, how does this sit with Oh, What a Lovely War? because it doesn't, to me, sit very well, though. And I can't remember if it's Croft or Perry. I'm sure one of them had worked as a writer with John Littlewood's theatre company at some point. I kind of got the feeling watching this episode it would be more anti-war and fruitless, and that is not what you get when you're watching this. So that is almost counter to that sort of late 60s reappraisal of the war, all being doom, gloom, slaughter. This doesn't have that feel at all.
No, there's a slight underlying nobility to this, firstly in the sense of what they're doing in regards to the Second World War, but the fact, the central conceit of, a lot of these guys were old soldiers and they're old men, also reflects onto the First World War a kind of a legitimacy is not necessarily the word that I'm looking for, but Jones and the like who were there weren't these kind of passive idiots who are taking part in something that's beyond them in the First World War. It was something that they did, but they did it when they were much younger.
Isn't it also a question? It's back to the question of class, isn't it? Because Littlewood's target are the generals and the politicians, and the rankers in Oh, the Lovely War they're the voice of reason, ultimately. Sentimentality occasionally, which they can be criticized for, but they're not the hypocrites and the monsters. And here again, we've got, okay, it's the rankers, but the ultimate butt of the joke, of course, is Mainwaring, isn't it? In the end, it's always the officer. So I think in some ways, typical of 1969. It's a class commentary, and they fit very nicely together in that sense.
But you have that slight class thing with Mainwaring that you always get the feeling he's probably lower middle class going up.
Certainly compared to Wilson.
But he's the officer, whereas John Le Mesurier, who is just beyond doubt to public skill, but he's only the sergeant. So you're pointing fun at almost the middle class guy and not the upper class guy in Dad's Army.
Isn't there a whole episode where it turns out that Wilson is like aristocracy, where he gets revealed that he actually has a title, and Mainwaring does not cope well with this at all. And because Wilson is very just, it's not all that. So it's kind of very gentle John Le Mesurier thing, and Mainwaring is seething at the fact that Wilson massively outranks him in terms of class.
But again, in some ways, that fits in with sort of class snobberies. And I'm thinking of it's slightly earlier, Ross McKibbin's Classes and Cultures, from which he looks at 1918 to 1950. But the extent to which it's actually the aspirational lower middle classes and the middle classes who are the most vicious about each other in terms of the competition in some ways, whereas the blue-collar working classes and the aristocracy, for all the aristocracy has issues throughout the first half of the 20th century, there's a lot more self-confidence and a sense of place at either extreme than there is in the middle. And for much of the 20th century, as class gets renegotiated, it tends to get renegotiated in the middle most viciously. So I think, certainly that's what Dad's Army is reflecting. Whether that's true of Littlewood quite so much, I don't know.
There's an interesting comparison as well between, say, Dad's Army and Blackadder, because both of them have at their heart like an element of absurdity. In Blackadder, it's the don't forget your stick. Yes, I wouldn't want to face a German machine gun without that. It's like, we're all going to die. Literally nothing here matters. Everything about this situation is insane. There's an element of that at times in Dad's Army. That's the famous episode where they're using Jonesy's van and they're sticking the rifles out to kind of potentially shoot down German Stukas, and like as a training exercise, like, the absurdity of like nothing you actually do here is going to dramatically change anything. But it's a more legitimate absurdity. They're trying to do something simply because it's the only thing they can do. Whereas in Blackadder wants to go home. He does not want to be here in any way, shape, or form, and is very, very aware that nothing that they do here will matter except that they're all going to die.
Which fits in with, how we, the Second World War as the just war, as the one that made a difference, whereas the First World War is just futile.
They are the embodiment of the People's War. They're not necessarily, it doesn't appear to be that they're dramatically helping the war effort, but they're doing their bit. And that doing your bit thing is like the central foundation of the People's War.
But if you ask the Home Guard platoon of Warmington-on-Sea was the first World War future, I would suspect to a man they would say no. They're then channeling 1940 attitudes, not 1969 attitudes. So the writers writing in 1969 have shifted out. But that could be based on the fact that, A, they were in the Home Guard and they knew what it felt like in 1940, and they're not from that post-war generation.
There's a weird quantum element to Dad's Army. It's existing simultaneously in 3 different time periods.
And that's perhaps its strength, that it doesn't lean too heavily into that sort of 60s reappraisal. And so many of those people who, old people in the 60s who remember the First World War watching it, people from the Second World War watching it, they would be the bulk of the TV watchers, and they can feel some sort of connection with that kind of patriotism, everyone trying to do their best, and then seeing the humour, because I'm sure that all of them sat through some of the oddities and nonsense of war that they didn't really understand, but somebody told them to do it.
Yeah, which creates a weird timelessness to it. The fact that it's existing simultaneously in multiple time periods, means that actually it still exists quite nicely in our time period. Whereas Blackadder, similarly, when we did our thing, holds up really, really well. There is a very post-60 element to Blackadder that actually kind of locks it into that time period.
And 80s kind of stick it to Mrs. Thatcher and the government kind of rebelliousness.
It'll be interesting to see if in 20 years' time, Blackadder is still as relevant as Dad's Army. Although Blackadder is still available and Dad's Army is not on YouTube. So
you don't have to fly across the Atlantic to watch Blackadder.
Do we need to talk about the final culminating scene, which we hinted at earlier?
Yes, well, because it's got Angus was, before we started recording, me and Angus were talking about it. It's got a beautiful, it's a really good gag at the end of it, but it's a perfectly Wilson moment.
Godfrey saved Mainwaring, who's got lost on an exercise in a smoking room, and Godfrey crawls in and drags him out. But then he's not hospitalised, he becomes bedridden, so the platoon go to thank him. And it's there that they discover that the photograph above the bed is Godfrey with his military medal, and they question him. Which leads Godfrey, it's a wonderful place. The closing lines are when Mainwaring says to Godfrey, "There's one thing I don't understand." Godfrey, "What's that? Why do you never wear your medals?" Godfrey, "Oh, they seem rather ostentatious." Mainwaring, "Ostentatious? If I'd won the military medal, I'd have worn it for the whole world to see." Godfrey, "Yes, but you look like a hero." Wilson, "You can't always go by appearances." But it's the whole platoon comes in and they thank him, and it kind of changed their mind because he's saved Mainwaring, who was to blame for putting too much smoke in the room for the exercise to start with.
They bring Godfrey back into the platoon as the medic, so he doesn't have to have a combat role. So from then onwards, he always has the Red Cross armband on his arm, because the reason why a lot of them were very upset that he left is that he was the only one who knew how to make good tea. Which
is a very important medical role for medical orderlies. They make the tea.
And is a big part of the British Second World War experience.
They knew all about it, and his sisters produced cakes. So he's gone full circle, backgrounded to being the medic.
And that ending scene, if you then take it in association with the 1972 Christmas special, where back in 1969, Mainwaring was saying, if I wore the military medal, I wore it on my chest for everyone to see. It was already foreshadowing the fact that he doesn't have any medals, because they'd be wearing them if he did.
I think the only other person we've not really touched on this is the fact that John Laurie, who's you play? It's gone out of my head. We're doomed. Fraser. John Laurie, the Fraser, the Undertaker. It also served in the First World War and was also on the Somme. It's usually a bit of a trope, isn't it? That, he played in the Somme. But their war service wasn't so. What I didn't quite understand was, I hands up, I'm not military of the military historian enough type to understand this. He served with the Royal Artillery. No, so he didn't. He served with the Honourable Artillery Company on the Somme. And I'm guessing he served in one of their infantry battalions rather than their artillery battalions, which I didn't know existed. But there you go, which I thought was interesting. Who then rarely ever spoke about the First World War again. Or I've never really scratching. I never found much about his First World War service. He seemingly didn't say a lot.
Let me see if I can find this book and see if there we go. Dad's Army Goes to War. One fact which was always certain was that Laurie hated speaking at length about his experiences as a soldier in the trenches of the Western Front during the First World War. Like his co-star Arnold Rigby, he saw active service at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Occasionally, he was known to sit quietly with Ridley near the set when not filming, and if Laurie was of a mind to get on with his fellow septuagenarian Ridley, they would share stories about their war in the trenches, that sounds absolutely right, that if they would talk about it, but only to the people they chose to talk about it to.
Yes, which was often each other.
I presume he joined up on the March 1916, so I assume he was conscripted. And he sees action on the Somme in November 1916. So that's actually the very, very end of the Somme.
Which is not a good time to be serving on the Somme. November 1916 on the Somme is pretty bleak, with the traditional Blackadder element of Haig deciding to make another Herculean effort to move his drinks cabinet 6 inches closer to Berlin.
What
is interesting is he fights at Passchendaele and he ends up with tuberculosis and trench nephritis. What's that?
Trench fever.
So there's not a lot we could say really about him in his First World War field service directly.
The only information it does say he never wrote an autobiography. I don't know if there's a biography of him, but that little biographical sketch is clearly not very good.
Yeah, not standing on a great deal.
I mean, it does. There are a number of quotes from him. He clearly did not enjoy the experience, and was somewhat traumatized by it. But
I wonder if that's why he's in the Royal Navy in Dad's army. He was at Jutland, I believe. Is Fraser, the Undertaker.
The jobs that they have are a fantastic ongoing gag, every single one of them. Just a running joke, because it just reappears at some point during a random episode, and you think, yeah, that's funny.
I had to look at it. I wasn't sure Godfrey's a retired tailor's assistant. He's not even the tailor.
No, but again, that's quite funny, because he's not proactive enough to be a tailor. He's so unassuming that he'd only be a tailor's assistant.
Just one final thought on Laurie is, we know that he serves, so he goes to the Somme November 1916, but then he survives the war and is demobilized, presumably not until 1918 or 1919. So he must have had other experiences than whatever he found so traumatic on the Somme.
The fact that the Somme then comes to dominate it is like the extended version of William Philpott's 1st of July syndrome, where the Somme comes to stand for everything.
But it's also that because he hasn't written an autobiography, the only memories we have are the ones that people choose to remember, which are about his reaction to, there's some sort of example of someone putting an image of the Somme on a screen and him saying, "Take it off. It was awful." But everything is around that particular war, and yet he had 2 more years of.
He served at the Tower of London towards the end of 1917.
Ah, right. Okay. Well,
and he's demobilised in January 1919.
So he might have been, if he's on home service, he might have had some sort of invalidity, some variety at that point.
Because the Tower of London isn't the worst place to be deployed during the First World War. I can definitely think of less good places.
I can think of worse home services.
He's in and out of hospital with his trench nephritis through 1917. Twice comes back to Southampton, which I presume is Netley.
Yeah, so presumably a long-term condition.
So do you think we've done Dad's Army branded to death? It's well worth watching, as is the Christmas special about the medals, where they all turn up and all the medals get described, who's got what for what, which they're a wonderful pair.
Anyway, I'm now going to have to go and properly hunt this out on Amazon, which I think is where I can get it.
Or Apple TV.
Or Apple TV.
Or America.
I'm off to the States in August. Maybe I'll spend some time watching it there. So I can write about it, because it's going to put an appearance in the book.
It's such a pleasure. Now, I'm not sure we quite know where we're going next episode, do we, Chris?
No, we've got the suggestion from Anne-Marie Einhaus, which we can look into at some point. I found, and I shared with Angus earlier, a graphic novel from 2000 AD called Rogue Trooper, Blighty Valley, which is basically like Spaceman gets sent to First World War, which could be funny.
Good Lord.
There's a BBC series called Sentinels, which is like grim, dark, superhero, First World War thing, which could be fun or ridiculous or both.
Well, I think the grimdark aesthetic's really interesting, how it's sort of become very popular. For people unaware, Rogue Trooper is almost, I mean, it comes right in the early 80s, late 70s. And the setting is a war-torn world of desolation, very similar to the First World War, with poisoned gas and slaughter. And war is all consuming.
There's also has now been announced that the computer game Gallipoli will release on the 20th of August, I believe. So we could potentially now investigate doing an episode about that in the future too.
Lots to choose from.
There was one thing I wanted, it's not even Dad's Army, but in spirit of the fact that the First World War ended yesterday, the World Cup ended yesterday, not to date when we're recording this, I discovered something that I don't think either of you two will have known yet. I shared it online, but I don't think either of you will have seen it.
I saw your comment online.
So the National World War I Museum and Memorial in America have been doing an ongoing thing. They're based in Kansas City, and the England team were based there. They've had lots of matches taking place in Kansas City, and they shared that in their museum they have a football shirt. And in 1918, a group of railway workers in Argentina wanted to form their own football team so they could compete in the local league. They needed to get the permission from the owner of the railway, the English owner of the railway that they were working on, and he agreed. But he had a kind of a request/order about what they name the team. So still playing to this day in like a very low league of Argentinian football is Athletic Club Douglas Haig. They play in red and black stripes, named in honour. They're formed in like the 18th of November 1918. So literally just after the First World War has finished. I am stunned that this has never come up at like a First World War Society conference. Secondly, I desperately want one of their shirts because that's absolutely insane.
Right, if we have any Argentinian listeners, can you help Chris out?
Apparently, Gary Sheffield mentioned it in his biography of Haig. So there you go, there's a weird little First World War popular culture thing that stunned me when I saw it online yesterday to the extent I couldn't understand what it was I was looking at.
Very good. Well, we'll leave it there then with that. As we all go off to Google and try and purchase a T-shirt.
Yeah, 100%.
Right, well, we'll see you next month.
See you then.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.